Are you tired of losing pawn races in chess? In today's video, we're diving deep into the essential concepts and game-winning ideas you need for these critical endgames. Make sure to watch until the end to learn all the techniques you need to promote your pawn first and sometimes even swindle losing positions. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. First things first, I want to start this video by talking about the fact that it is not the quantity of pawns that matter, rather the quality. And in this case, if the white king tries to catch this pawn, it is simply impossible because the pawn is too far advanced and the white king is outside of the box. Check out my king and pawn video for that. However, in this position, white has an interesting defensive resource. It doesn't work, but you should try this in the game anyways, because your opponent could blunder. And if we take a look at this position, out of these three pawns, which one is the most dangerous? The most dangerous one is e6 because that is the one that is the furthest advanced and it is only 2 squares away from promotion. So in this case, after a move like pawn to c5 check, we do not want to take either of these two pawns because white will simply push and make a queen earlier than black, and this is simply going to be winning for the white pieces. The queening is stopped and white wins this position. However, what we can do in this case after pawn to c5 is that we can go back to e7, and if our opponent goes to d6 with a check, we simply capture the pawn, and the main thing is we immobilize the pawn. So because we know the white king cannot catch the pawn on a4 because this pawn is too far advanced and the white king is outside of the square. However, these two pawns, we don't need to go after the c5 pawn specifically. We can just keep our king here because if we actually go after the pawn, white pushes. But the thing is, neither of these two pawns can be pushed because we would capture. In either case, we would capture the d pawn. Therefore, there's nothing that these two pawns can do without the help of the king, and the king is too far away, so it doesn't really matter. So the main thing is we need to immobilize these pawns. We don't need to win them right away. As long as we immobilize them, we can make a queen and then win them later on. There is one more trick in this position. If instead of d6, they play c6 in order to go c7, for example, a3, c7, now we cannot stop queening. We need to go back to d6, and this is the clever defensive resource. Let's say the king comes closer. We do not want to take this pawn. Our goal here is to stop both e7 and c7. So in this case, if the king comes closer, we would push once again, but if one of the pawns is pushed, we take the one that is pushed, and if the other one pushes, then we come to stop it, and once again the pawns are immobilized. So it's not the quantity of pawns that matter, it is the quality. Another very important detail that you have to know in order to be good at king and pawn endgames and in order to be good at pawn races, that is that you need to be good at queen versus passed pawn endgames. And this is very important because a lot of pawn races will turn into queen versus passed pawn positions, such as the one that you see on the screen right now. And you will need to work a lot in order to win this position, and you need to know the winning technique. So for example, after queen to b1, let's say the king goes to f2. What do you do now? Do you know how to win this position? It is theoretically winning, but it is difficult. It's not so easy because on the next move, if you don't do anything, the pawn will simply promote and the position will be a draw. So make sure you guys check out my queen versus passed pawn video because it is going to be closely related to what we are talking about today. So principle number 2 is going to be to avoid unnecessary pawns. So in this position, black plays this move king to g5. After king g5, it's very clear that black wants to take the pawn on h5, move the king out of the way, and then make a queen with the h pawn, pushing this pawn all the way down to h1. And we should be looking at the same idea, but doing it with the a pawn. However, if in this case we get too distracted and we take the pawn on c5, so let's say king takes c5 is played, now this position is simply lost because we are no longer in time to promote our pawn on a8 because black promotes first and actually stops us from promoting. We will see the rook pawn ideas more in the later part of this video as well. But if instead of king takes c5 we go king b5, then after captures both sides sides capture and both sides start pushing their pawns, white is the one that's queening first, and white is the one that is going to be winning this game. So let me show you another example, and we have a position like this. It is black to move, and if in this position we take the pawn on c4, the problem is that the white king gets active, and now the position is a draw because the white king is simply too close to our pawns. And actually you need to be careful not to blunder this as black, because the white king is so much superior to the black king. However, if instead of king takes c4, we go king c5, which is the winning move, now the white king is forced to stay on the 7th rank. It cannot cross the 6th rank. Well, it can go to a6. This is not a square that black is controlling, but of course, why would the king go there? The thing is, the king has to stay on the 7th rank, and now we push the h pawn. Now we push the f pawn, and even though the king gets to g5, we sacrifice one of these pawns, and then we create a passed pawn, either with f3, f2, f1, or you can also play f3 and go h3, h2, h1. These are both kind of similar. It doesn't matter which one you do, but you always have to be careful not to get checked. You should watch out for this. This is a very, very dangerous idea. In this case, black is too fast. We will also talk about this concept later on in the video. So there's multiple concepts here going on at once, but let's focus on avoiding unnecessary pawns for now. This is the concept of this part. There's one more position that I want to show you, and it is this one right here. After king to d7, king to d5, if we play a very natural move, king takes c7, black will also take the pawn on c5, and after king b7, king d6, the problem is we are stuck on the a file, and there's no way for white to cross the a file, therefore the pawn cannot promote, and both sides simply push their pawns, and unfortunately this position just ends in a stalemate, because if black steps off of protecting any of these two squares, and let's say king to b6 is played, this is of course winning for white, because white makes the queen first. But if black just pushes, this position is a draw due to stalemate. So instead of king takes c7, the correct move in this position is to avoid this pawn on c7 and to go king c8. And this is very important because after king takes c5, king to b7, king b5, we take the pawn, black pushes, but it doesn't matter because we're just going to be much, much faster. After king b7, both sides push their pawns. We queen first, and if c2 is played, we bring the queen to a1, we blockade the promotion square, and this is easily winning. So the next concept that I want to talk about is queening with a check. So in this position, both sides are simply pushing their passed pawns. However, as it turns out, white is the one that is going to queen first, and white is queening with a check on the black king. This means that black does not have enough time to promote his pawn, and after a move like king to e4, queen b1, king to f3, white will simply blockade the passed pawn, and black does not get the chance to promote. And this brings us to our next principle, and that is never step into a check, and this is very important. So let me just go back to the beginning position here. So from here, both sides are just simply trying to win each other's pawns. White just won c4, black is about to win h4, and black has a choice to make here. Black needs to step out of the h file in order to allow this pawn to promote, but where does he go? There's only one bad move here, and there are two, well, there's technically two bad moves. King h3 also loses because it just blocks the pawn. But in order to step off the h line, you need to avoid this diagonal right here, because c8 is the square where this white pawn is going to promote, and if you step into this diagonal, you will lose the game. So for example, if you play king to g4, this is simply losing because after both sides push their pawns, white queens with a check, and even though sometimes a rook pawn and the king, it's a draw in a lot of positions, however, in this case, we are able to blockade the promotion square with a move like queen c6. The king doesn't go to g2, so this is another one of those situations where you need to know queen versus passed pawn endgames. Once the queen gets to h1, this position is completely lost for the black pieces. So in order to avoid that, you need to either go to g5 or go to g3, and once that happens, this position is actually a draw, because after both sides push their pawns, both sides will queen, and of course queen versus queen is a draw, so make sure you never step into a check. So the next principle that we're going to talk about is the fact that the rook pawn will stop another rook pawn from promoting if it promotes first. So in this case, if both sides just simply push their pawns, what will happen is that one side will promote first, in this case that is the white pieces, and it will prevent black from promoting as well, because this is a large this is the big diagonal. So once one side promotes, it is going to control this whole diagonal, and it is going to control the promotion square of the other side. So this is simply going to be losing for the black pieces. So this is something that you always have to keep in mind when both sides have rook pawns that are trying to promote. So let me just show you a puzzle right now. If you want to solve this puzzle, please pause the video and try to solve it. Otherwise, I'm just going to show the answer. I will give you 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the correct move in this position is this move, knight to a5. Technically, there are two winning moves. Knight a5 wins and knight d4 also wins. However, knight a5 is more forcing. It's just simpler. So after knight a5, the black king is not forced to take this knight, because he can do other things as well. But there's only one way to try to make progress as the black pieces, and that is to take the knight. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to push the pawn. So black accepts the knight, and now both sides just simply step out of the way. However, after both sides push their pawns, what we find out is that white is the one who is queening first, and white is the one that is going to be winning this position. So let me give you another example here. So once again, pause the video if you want to try to solve this puzzle. I will give you 3, 2, 1. There you go. So in this position, the correct move is a5. I'm sure a lot of you already guessed that. After h4 though, and b6, after black captures, what you need to do is actually push a6. This is the theme of this whole section, and you need to figure out that you need to make a pawn. You need to have an a pawn in order to stop black from promoting. Once the pawn promotes on a8, it will control h1, and the black pawn on h2 simply does not get enough chance to shine in the game, unfortunately. If you were to capture this pawn on b6, you would actually lose the game because both sides would queen. However, in this case, black has too many pawns, and this position is completely winning for the black pieces. Principle number 5 is going to be, just because both sides queen does not mean the position is equal. So in this case, both sides are trying to push their passed pawns once again. This is the theme of the video. But in this case, both sides queen. So does this mean that the position is a draw? In some cases, yes. In most cases, it is actually going to be yes. However, there are going to be certain scenarios where it is not going to be a draw, such as the case you see on the screen right now. In this position, we have this move queen to f8. And because the kings are facing each other, the black king cannot go to the e file. It, of course, cannot stay on the f file. It is forced to go to either g6 or g5. However, it doesn't matter where the black king goes. In this case, we can skewer the black king and win the queen on g1. So the king moves, we win the queen, and we win the game. So once again, let me show you yet another position where this is the case. In this case, you have to find the winning idea. So I will give you 3, 2, 1. Okay, the winning move in this position is this move, knight to d5. And this is very important because if white simply pushes, we can go knight e7 and stop the promotion. If the king, let's say, goes to f6, we can give a check, and this actually gives us enough time to win the game, because after a move like king to c1, white captures, we make a queen, and we need to know that this position is winning. If you guys know your endgames, you will know that this position with the knight's pawn is winning for the queen. If it was a bishop's pawn, it would be a draw. But in this case, it is a knight's pawn, so the position is winning. And there is yet another idea here. If the knight is taken right here on the first move, so after knight to d5, if the sacrificed knight is accepted, this is where the skewer idea comes in. You just simply have to move the king out of the way. You just need to get on this diagonal once you promote. So let's just say king c1, for example, g7, b1 queen, g8 queen. You can either play queen b3 or queen a2. Both moves win because you skewer the white king and you win the queen on g8, and this position is of course completely winning. So now I'm going to teach you guys Reti's idea, and this position right here was composed by Richard Reti, Czechoslovakian chess player. So in this position, white is miraculously not losing, even though this pawn right here is super far advanced. If it queens, it's gonna queen with a check if the king stays on the h file. However, this pawn can easily be stopped by the king on a6. So for example, if we were to push this pawn, white would lose here because after king to b7, this pawn simply cannot be defended. However, in chess, what you guys need to realize is that geometry works differently than in mathematics, for example. So in this case, if we were to compare these two moves, king g7 and king h7, both of them travel the same amount of distance when it comes to catching up to this pawn on h5. They're both advancing by 1 square. However, a crucial difference between these two moves is that after king to g7, not only you're getting closer to this pawn on h5, which you're trying to stop, you're also getting closer to your pawn on c6. And after a move like h4, you go king f6, and what happens here is that after a move like h3, you don't need to catch this pawn, you only need to try to promote your pawn just like this. If the pawn goes to h2, you go to c7. Because the king is on a6, you will be queening with a check if you were to queen. So the king tries to stop it, but this is simply not enough, because after king to d7, you will queen with check once again, and this position is simply going to be a draw because both sides will have a queen. Queen versus queen is most of the times going to be a draw. However, if the black king tries to stop this pawn, let's say you go king to b6 in order to try to stop this, well, okay, fine. Now the king will simply go to e5, and it still continues its journey on this diagonal, trying to both stop this pawn and also to assist this pawn right here. So if a move like h3 is played, king d6, h2, c7, h1, c8 queen, the position ends in a draw. However, if instead of h3 the pawn is captured, now king to f4 is played, and now we can stop this pawn and the position is once again a draw. So this is sort of a miraculous way for white to defend this position, and even though this position is not something you're actually going to encounter in your games, this exact position, however, you can use this idea in order to win some other type of king and pawn endgames. And let me show you a puzzle just like this one right here. So I want you guys to pause the video and try to solve this. I will give you 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. The correct move in this position is this move, king to c4. And a lot of you might have been thinking a move like king e5 or maybe king c5. However, these moves are not good. Why? Because the priority here is to promote the pawn, and our king needs to both try to support this pawn and also try to stop this pawn on a6. If we go to c5, black will simply push, we will push, black will push, we will push, both sides will queen here. I think you get the idea. If we try to stop the pawn though, what will happen is that the black king will catch up and try to stop our pawn as well, and this actually ends up in a winning position for the black pieces because black is closer to our pawns, and this is going to be lost for white. However, if instead of king c5 we play king to c4, now a situation is different, because after a move like a5, d4, a4, d5. Now our king is one square lower. That means that we actually, in this position, we don't need to play a move like king b4. We can wait for the pawn to get to a3, and then we can stop the pawn. So after we push here, black also pushes. We catch the pawn with king b3. However, black does not get to catch the pawn with king e4 because we just simply push, and after a couple of moves we will queen, but black will not be queening. So if you guys found this idea, let me know in the comments below if you were able to solve this puzzle and utilize Reti's idea to solve it. Now I will move on to the next chapter. So the next principle that I want to talk about is that you need to push the pawn that you're trying to promote as far as possible. So this position that you see on the screen right now is actually a draw. However, after king to f5, this is winning for the white pieces if white finds the correct move. So what is the correct move in this position? Well, if we take a look at this, we have a couple of options. Well, actually 3 options to be exact. We have captures on h4, we have b5, and we have a5. These are the 3 options. If we lazily capture on h4, this is just simply going to lose because it's not going to be good enough for us. We don't have enough time to actually capture that pawn. White will simply lose this game. The black will promote the a pawn most likely. However, going back, if we play this move pawn to b5, now we run into a different issue because there's a5 and the position simply gets locked. What's funny is that even if black captures, which is actually not the correct move by the black pieces here, and black plays this move a5, the problem is it's still winning for black because both sides queen, and after this queening by black, the position is still winning because this pawn on d5 will be lost and the position will end up 2 pawns most likely for the black pieces, probably because white will take this pawn on h4. So that is what will happen. So the correct move is to utilize the principle that I've just taught you and actually push the pawn that you're trying to promote as far as possible, and that is to play this move a5. After a5, there is a problem here because after a move like king to e5, we go b5, and after captures we go a6. And the thing is, in this case, because we started with a5, this pawn race is going to be won by the white pieces because after a5, you see there was no b4 here, so that tempo that could have been used to push this pawn was actually used by the king because the king went to e5, and this gave us enough time to make a queen while the black pawn only reached b2. So that's why this position is winning according to this principle. And what's funny is that if I go back, this position is a draw before king f5, and the defensive resource is actually king to f6. After king f6, if we go with the same plan, the problem is this is simply not going to work because the black king will simply catch the pawns, and now this position is lost because the black king will win all of the pawns over here, and this will simply result in a losing position. Just like this is simply losing because the king will move out of the way, the pawn will push, the position is lost. So make sure whenever you're trying to win a pawn race, you push the desired pawn that you're trying to promote as far as possible. In this case, that is the a pawn. So principle number 7 is going to be you don't have to participate in the pawn race. So in this position, white is actually better. However, in this position, what happened was that white captured the pawn on h2, and now the position is winning for the black pieces if you play the correct sequence. So in this position, the correct sequence is to capture the bishop on d5, and after pawn captures back, you need to be very careful. If you push the pawn, you will participate in a pawn race, which you will lose because after a couple of moves just like this is simply going to be winning for the white pieces because white will end up with an extra pawn. However, if you simply keep this pawn right here on f5, this is actually going to be winning for black because you don't have to push it, you can let the white king come to you, and what happens is that both sides will simply capture each other's pawns. There's no way to defend d4, and black is actually closer to white's pawns. So you need to make sure whenever you're in scenarios like this, you don't always have to push the pawn, you don't always have to participate in the pawn race. And lastly, we have the famous Grigoriev position right here, this sort of a famous pawn race. And if you guys want to try to solve this, pause the video right now. This is a difficult puzzle. You need to combine multiple principles in order to solve this one puzzle. So if you guys want to see the answer, I will show it in 3, 2, 1. The correct move in this position is king to d4. Now, why is it king to d4? First of all, let's take a look at a more natural move, which is pawn to f4. The problem with pawn to f4 is that black, once again, does not have to participate in the pawn race. Black does not have to play b5. What black can play is actually king b5, and after a couple of moves, black can try to catch this pawn and then try to draw the game just like this. So what we need to do is, first and foremost, we need to go king d4, which blocks the king's way, because if the king tries to come up, we go king d5, and now the thing is the pawn is also blocked and the king cannot come closer. After this, we can start pushing our pawn, and this is a winning position. So after a move like king to d4, the only option our opponent has is b5. He simply is forced to participate in the pawn race. We go f4, he goes b4, we go f5, b3. Now we need to be careful. If we push f6, this simply turns into a queen versus queen. That is a draw. However, we can actually turn this into a better queen versus queen position if we play this move king to c3, sorry, but not here. Before you play f6, you need to play king c3. Now the pawn cannot be pushed, so the only move in this position is king a3. And now what I want you to notice is that the king is on the checking square. It is on a3. From f8, the queen will check the king on a3. So after king a3, we push the pawn, black pushes the pawn, we push the pawn, black queens, we queen with check. However, remember earlier we talked about the fact that even if we queen, sometimes that position is not a draw. Sometimes it is winning because of various skewer ideas. This is one of those cases. Queen to a8 check forces the king over to b5, only legal move. Now both queen b8 and queen b7 pick up the queen on b1, and this position is winning for the white pieces. Once again, make sure you guys check out queen versus passed pawn endgames, because that is closely related to pawn races, and in order to be good at pawn races, you need to know that endgame. Other than that, I will see you in the next video. Peace!